Yeah, my presentation is on Immortality as Body Horror in the Souls series. Originally, I wanted to tackle all of the Souls games and the Souls-likes games, but that was way too much for 20 minutes. Um, so this presentation will be in three parts. Um, First, I'll discuss player character synthesis, which is a discussion in philosophical literature and performance studies around video games about sort of what it means to act as a character, as a player, and how this fits into discussions of body augmentation. Second, we will discuss a little bit of the lore of Dark Souls, at least what I to this talk, and then finally how Dark Souls uses its narrative and sort of the philosophy behind player character activity to turn sort of immortality into a horrorscape. Like I said, for the sake of time, I'll be focusing on Dark Souls 1 and 3, though all FromSoft games sort of provide similar themes. I'll discuss those very briefly. And the reason for the loss of Dark Souls 2 is that the creative lead for 1 and 3, Hidetaka Miyazaki, was not really present for Dark Souls 2. He was off working on Bloodborne, which was just previously mentioned. So the narrative is much more cohesive when we take 1 and 3 together and sort of take 2 as something else. So, in case you're unfamiliar, Dark Souls is a trilogy of third-person action role-playing games, sort of known for three different things. First, a fairly brutal difficulty curve, which has in its own right spawned a new genre of video games called Souls-likes, a fairly stunning and novel fantasy design for the most part, and an understated but rich narrative, by which I mean that while there is a pretty interesting base of lore that a lot of people have written a lot on, a lot of it is hidden from the player without extra digging and reading of things like item descriptions or paying attention to the very minute details on different structures and weapons. The first game released critical acclaim in 2011, which spawned the two sequels in 2014 and 2016. And today we will just focus on three pieces of the epic: the Dark Sign, Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, and the climactic battle with Gale at the end of the final DLC for Dark Souls 3, The Ringed City. So, virtual actions. Player actions have tended to be a fairly complex issue in game studies. But the consensus has tended to be that what occurs when players operate as characters within the space of a game is fairly unique. Um, while some have called it a performative activity, it's also been discussed as a type of embodiment or amplification or other things along those lines, but regardless, something different from the way we might think of an actor on a stage. Zamir, in talking about performance studies, discusses what he calls existential amplification, um, which he talks as a type of embodiment in which a person or an actor pushes their will into a character and extends the sort of meaning-making capacities they have through the activities they can make as that character. So in video games, player embodiment is the existential amplification of a player's knowledge and choices into or through a virtual character. Now, what I mean by this is a little complicated, and for the sake of time, I'm going to brush over some of it, using a couple quotes here from Robson and Meskin and Velleman, who both discuss this issue. So Robson and Meskin, in their paper titled Self-Involving Interactions Fictions, describe it thus. Consider the difference between instances of make-believe, where a child imagines that she is Superman flying, and those where she imagines that she can fly like Superman. In the first case, the child imagines herself to be identical with a particular fictional character, Superman in this case, who possesses certain fantastical abilities, whereas in the second, she merely imagines herself possessing the relevant abilities without also imagining herself to be identical with any individual, fictional or otherwise, distinct from herself. Fellow men sort of before Robson and Meskin touches on a similar problem. He writes that the players of a game are aware of dealing with objects and events that, however fictional, are still not for them to conjure up or conjure away. These objects and events have the determinateness and recalcitrance characteristic of reality, and so the players tend to have more realistic attitudes towards them. The player's cognitive attitudes must conform to the truths of a world that is not of their invention, and that world can frustrate or disappoint them as their own fantasies cannot. In essence, both of these writers are suggesting that the player maintains a type of paradox where they are both themselves and a character. Statements like, I killed the dragon, and the knight I am playing killed the dragon are simultaneously true. We thus act as both ourselves and our characters, oftentimes enmeshed, and the potential contradictions between our desires and the characters. That is, that sometimes a player's desires and choices into a game are different from the sort of narrative outcomes that are built into it, creating these difficulties where the player wants to act a way that the character won't allow, or alternatively, the game takes away control from the player and does something that the player doesn't want to do. In Dark Souls, this problem is actually avoided in some pretty interesting ways, and which brings into a lot of this discussion of body augmentation. So, this sort of synthesis between player and character, I should say, is brought into immortality. That is, that immortality is sort of the baseline for this synthesis. The ability to try and try again is the feature of game design that allows us to perform in these ways. Most of the time, a game ignores this as part of the narrative structure. That is, if you play a game such as Tomb Raider, for example, and you die sort of trying to figure out a puzzle, when you reach the end of the game, the characters are not shocked to find Lara Croft resurrected. The game ignores the fact that you've died. You simply respawn and you try again in the same sort of narrative structure. Some games, however, make this a part of their core narrative. Um, for example, Undertale calls it determination, which is the ability to make save states and sort of try and try again. And in Dark Souls, we get this sort of symbolized in an item called humanity, which when a player dies, they lose and then can restore. Thus, we as players are augmented through the control of the game through its meta elements, the ability to have a save screen, a stats screen, and a UI that suggests that we are both within and removed from the narrative. Dark Souls furthers the link between player and character by not pausing the game while the player's in the menus. That is, some of these meta activities that help us to sort of separate ourselves from what we're doing as a character are removed, blurring the lines between the game and the world, and thus the player and the character. And secondarily, deaths are a part of the world. Rather than resetting, the world continues with that death marked, with some characters actually remarking on this, especially in the third game. Thus, while augmentation often refers to a physical, material integration of some outside, usually mechanical device, the implicit augmentation of all games is a metaphysical integration of digital elements with the player's real-world decisions. We are transported from the purely physical into a liminal space between our body and the digital body of our avatar, between our life and the character's life, between our ability to choose and the character's. This metaphysical augmentation culminates in our ability to snap our fingers and reset that liminal space, taking on that sort of immortal ability, with the creators of the game giving us the power to hold it together for as long as we so choose. We are thus a cyborg, with half a physical mind and half a digital mind, striving to synthesize these two simultaneous existences in a way that produces enjoyment in both the digital and the real. It is here where Dark Souls, unlike so many other games, reaches out into that liminal space. But rather than trying to pull us into its world, it tries to push us out. Its brutal difficulty and hopeless narrative do their best to make the player let go, while that challenge simultaneously eggs many on, and its hopeless narrative provides a backdrop to an interesting and original fantasy world. In our resistance against its push, we begin to melt into a horror, digitally realized in the game and metaphysically realized in the self. But to fully understand this, we must understand its world. So, the lore of Dark Souls. In this first column here is essentially all of the narrative context the player is given upon booting up Dark Souls for the first time. It's about a 3-minute cutscene. Um, it probably constitutes about 40 or 50% of all of the major spoken dialogue in the game, and is all that most players will get outside of a couple other conversations right towards the end of the game. And so, although there's a lot of information here, there are 2 points that are particularly important. First, the idea of an age of fire or an age of gods that is supposed to be followed by an age of dark or an age of man, and the cursed dark sign not originally being a component of human existence. By Dark Souls 3, we learned that the Dark Sign was actually a brand given to humans when Gwyn extended the Age of Fire as a desperate clinging to his own immortality. And the cycle has continued so long by the end of the third game that nobody wants to extend it anymore, not even some of the gods. In fact, the player character of Dark Souls 3 is a character who has already done what Gwyn did by sacrificing themselves on the flame to continue the age. And so some characters are so desperate and trying to find people willing to do it that they resurrect people who already have. So, the dark sign is a really interesting component of all three Dark Souls games, and it has granted humanity a cursed immortality. That is, that humanity, with the brand, could essentially extend their lifespan through the accumulation of souls, which are a sort of literal representation of power within the world. However, upon death, they would eventually become undead, which, as more deaths accrue, lead them to become grotesque horrors. Um, Pictured to the right is one of these sort of undead characters. After enough deaths, the human will gives up, called hollowing, and the once person begins to transform into a maddened, grotesque undead. The character to the right is a hollow, one of the first enemies that a player will meet upon reaching into Dark Souls 1, and they continue through all three games in the series. They're maddened characters, they automatically aggro to you, and their sort of attacks tend to just be wild swings um, at any attempt to get close to them. What this suggests is that immortality is averse to our sort of natural purpose as human beings within the world of Dark Souls and perhaps within the real world as well. We live once, we act once, we die once. Thus, a choice to participate in the cycle creates the horrible amalgamations of suffering and this eternal sort of endless existence. By the end of Dark Souls 3, things have gotten pretty bad and fairly desperate. This is encapsulated in a character named Gale. Uh, Gale, like the player character, is trapped in an Immortal Shell 2, desperately seeking an escape. But unlike the player, he finds hope in the possibility of a new world, which he believes can be created by a magical painter if he can collect all of the living souls that still exist within the world of Dark Souls. The player, conversely, finds hope in the continued existence of the world that they are currently inhabiting. That is the world that has been presented to them in Dark Souls 3. Thus, the end of the series culminates in a battle at the literal end of the world and a desolate wasteland that is left at the end of time, where the player's character and Gale are presumably the only living beings still there. Now, like I said, there are similar features in most FromSoft Souls-like games. Bloodborne, you see this transcendence through knowledge, but this knowledge often leads to a type of madness and a transformation into eldritch horrors. That is, to become immortal, one must become a sort of Cthulhu-like entity. In Sekiro, immortality is granted to a special lineage of dragon's blood, but it slowly kills all living beings in the world every time somebody resurrects using its power, giving them an incurable disease called dragon rot. In Elden Ring, characters pursue immortality through runes and grafting, which often leads to transformation into chimeric monstrosities. But in each game, there's a culminating battle against an entity that is either seeking to maintain that world that is slowly dying, or a character who is trying to break the player out of that pursuit in a sort of mercy kill. So, what does this mean for us playing games? Well, in Dark Souls, the character is really an analog of the player, and this is shown through its narrative. The cycle within the game does not turn the character hollow because the player still has a will to complete the game. Once the player gives up, though, the character goes hollow. Thus, the player and the character's goals are perfectly enmeshed. The player does not want to see the game end, and the character does not want to see their world fade away. Frequently, we play games to escape to another world, but ultimately, this seems to be our undoing. Chasing the eternal robs our actions of their meaning, and we see this visually in the hollowing of creatures in the Souls series. That is, that as a character acts and acts and acts, trying to break out of their undead curse and undead cycle, they just end up slowly losing the sort of meaning of life that they had been clinging to. And arguably, we can hollow in real life too, losing ourselves to a digital world, particularly one that provides no respite, like Dark Souls, rather than meaningfully acting in the real one. Thus, at face value, the granted immortality of a game world enhances our ability to make meaning as we are able to continuously pursue new lives and activities in these digital worlds. However, Dark Souls suggests that, in reality, this continuous pursuit becomes an obsession. Just as those obsessed with immortality and myth often forget how to live in that pursuit, those who obsess over scouring and continuing to escape into a game world do so at the expense of their ability to meaningfully act in both the game and their real lives. The humans of Dark Souls go hollow in their pursuit, becoming nothing but husks of their former humanity, just as a person obsessed with the pursuit of a perhaps untenable end in a game become nothing but a hollow representation of their former selves. While within Dark Souls proper, it is the gods which grant the humans immortality, even if accidentally, within the context of our human interaction with the game, we are the one with that power. We imbue our character with immortality, cursing it to a doomed, repetitive existence in which every action puts one further into the cycle. We choose to try again after every death. We choose to give another try with a different build. We choose to play over and over in the restless pursuit of the elusive release of meaningful completion, something which never comes to those trapped in an eternal cycle. In fact, Dark Souls acknowledges this problem in its own gameplay, in which, upon beating the game, players are only faced with the same game with more difficulty. No new content, no new areas, no new story. The same landscape, only more brutal than the last. But, like Gwyn, we sacrifice ourselves to keep that game alive. And, like Gale, we relentlessly pursue the game's continued existence, no matter the cost. To end the cycle in Dark Souls, one must step away from that first flame, accept the fate of death rather than sacrifice, and allow the proper progression of time. To end the cycle of obsession and its associated meaninglessness in our lives, we must willingly step away from that game, making the decision to close that chapter and progress forward. I end this presentation with one note. The synthesis in a horrific tale of immortality and meaninglessness is not to suggest the games are themselves meaningless. Rather, it is to show that games, just like any other activity we humans perform, are meaningful in their finitude. Dark Souls is a game full of narrative, visual, and gameplay brilliance, meaningful in its novelty as a series and narrative. But it loses that meaning as we play and play and play, lost in a world that tells us that losing ourselves is the worst kind of curse. To quote from a couple of characters from near the end of the third game, the fire linking curse, the legacy of lords, let it all fade into nothing. You've done quite enough, now have your rest. Sometimes the most meaningful action we can do is to let something rest. Thank you.